The salt-heavy wind of the Atlantic coast whipped through Illyra's hair, mirroring the turbulent grief that usually surfaced this time of year. It had been 3 years to the day since the world had lost Evelyn Thorne, Illyra's grandmother, her anchor, and the woman who had taught her that the most valuable things in life weren't bought, but earned through kindness and resilience. Illyra stood on the balcony of the cliffside cottage Julian had rented for the weekend. The healing retreat, he had called it. He knew how the anniversary of Evelyn's passing haunted her. He knew how she often sat in silence on March 21st, tracing the phantom weight of her grandmother's hand in hers. Julian was the perfect boyfriend, attentive, ambitious, and seemingly attuned to every frequency of her heart. "You're thinking about her again," a soft voice said from behind. Julian stepped onto the balcony, 2 glasses of vintage red wine in hand. He looked like a vision of stability, his linen shirt crisp despite the humidity, his smile warm and reassuring. He handed her a glass and wrapped his free arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "I can't help it," Illyra whispered, leaning into his warmth. She would have loved this view. She always said the ocean was the only thing big enough to hold a person's secrets. "Tonight isn't for secrets, Illyra," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, honey-thick with a strange, nervous energy she couldn't quite place. "Tonight is for the future. I want to replace those sad memories with something beautiful. Something permanent." He guided her inside the cottage, where the atmosphere had been meticulously curated. Hundreds of candles flickered in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls. A record player in the corner hummed a low, soulful jazz melody. The table was set with porcelain and silver, the scent of rosemary and roasted lamb lingering in the air. It was a scene of cinematic perfection, the kind of romantic gesture most women dreamed of. Yet, for some reason, a small, cold knot tightened in Illyra's stomach. They ate in a comfortable, if somewhat staged, silence. Julian was more talkative than usual, rambling about his plans for his new firm and the legacy he wanted to build. He talked about roots, about family, and about how a man is nothing without the right woman by his side to ground him. "You've been my ground, Illyra," he said, setting his fork down. His eyes were intense, almost frantic. "Even when things were tough, even when the money was tight this past year, thinking of you kept me focused." "Julian, you didn't have to do all this," she said, gesturing to the lavish spread. "Just being here with you is enough." "No, it isn't," he countered. He stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sharp, jarring sound. He walked around the table and took her hand, leading her toward the center of the room, right beneath the glow of the chandelier. "I spent a long time looking for the right way to do this," he began, dropping slowly to one knee. "I wanted something that carried weight. Something that wasn't just a piece of jewelry from a glass case, but something that had a soul. Something that belonged to a history as deep as ours." Illyra's breath hitched. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a mixture of excitement and a bizarre, rising dread she couldn't explain. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered velvet box. It wasn't the navy blue of a modern jeweler, it was a dusty, faded crimson, the fabric worn thin at the corners. He flipped the lid. The candlelight caught the stone first. It was a large, rectangular emerald, its green depths clouded with gardens, the natural inclusions that made the stone look like a trapped forest. It was set in an ornate, heavy gold band, intricately carved with a pattern of winding ivy and tiny, hidden thorns. "Illyra Thorne," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife and sharing your life with me, forever?" The ring was magnificent. It was ancient, heavy, and radiated a sense of timelessness. But as Illyra looked at it, the air in the room seemed to turn frigid. A wave of vertigo washed over her. "I know this ring," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. It was a ridiculous thought. Julian had told her he'd been saving a family heirloom for months. It was a treasure from his lineage, he'd said. And yet, looking at the way the ivy vines coiled around the emerald, she felt a sickening sense of recognition. It looked exactly like the ring Evelyn Thorne had worn every single day of her life. The ring that had been buried with her, per her written instructions, 3 years ago. Illyra. Julian's smile wavered. Is that a yes? She forced her lungs to take in air. She told herself she was being paranoid. Grief did strange things to the memory. Emeralds were common, ivy patterns were a staple of Victorian jewelry. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. Yes, she breathed, the word feeling like a lie even as she said it. Yes, Julian. He let out a jagged sigh of relief and took her hand. As he slid the gold band onto her finger, Illyra didn't feel the warmth of a new beginning. The metal felt unnaturally, impossibly cold, like a piece of ice pressed against her skin. It was heavy, weighing her hand down as if the ring itself wanted to pull her back into the earth. He stood up and kissed her deeply, but Illyra's eyes remained open, staring over his shoulder at the flickering candles. Her gaze drifted down to her hand. The ring fit perfectly. Too perfectly. As Julian pulled back, beaming with a triumphant, hungry light in his eyes, Illyra felt the first genuine chill of the night. It wasn't the wind from the ocean. It was the feeling of something that should have been at rest, now sitting heavy and stolen upon her finger. It's a family treasure, Julian repeated, kissing her forehead. I've been waiting for the right moment to bring it back into the light. Illyra looked at the emerald. In the dim light, the clouded center of the stone seemed to shift, like a lidless eye staring back at her. The question in the dark had been asked and answered, but the true mystery had only just begun. The morning sun rose over the Atlantic with a cruel, blinding brilliance, shattering the romantic shadows of the previous night. Illyra awoke before Julian, the rhythmic sound of his breathing beside her feeling suddenly intrusive, like a clock ticking in a room where she was trying to hide. She didn't move her body, but her gaze went instantly to her left hand. The emerald seemed to glow in the dawn light, its green hue so deep it was almost black. The weight of it was a physical burden. Throughout the night, she had dreamt of cold earth and the sound of a shovel striking stone, a sound she hadn't heard in 3 years, yet one her subconscious had reconstructed with terrifying accuracy. Carefully, so as not to wake him, Illyra slipped out of the silk sheets and padded into the small, sun-drenched kitchenette of the cottage. She made a cup of coffee she didn't want, her hands shaking so much the ceramic rattled against the saucer. She held her hand up to the window, letting the direct sunlight pierce the heart of the stone. In the dim candlelight of the proposal, the emerald had looked like a sea of moss. But in the harsh, honest light of day, the gardens within the stone, those tiny internal fractures and inclusions formed a very specific map. And there, on the bottom right corner of the rectangular cut, was a tiny, jagged chip. It was microscopic, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there, but to Illyra, it was a mountain. A memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. August, 4 years ago. The garden at the family estate. Grandmother Evelyn had been pruning her prized tea roses. Illyra had been sitting on the grass, reading aloud. Evelyn had reached for a stubborn branch, her hand slipping, and the heavy gold ring had struck the granite edge of a planter. Illyra remembered the sharp clack of stone on stone. She remembered Evelyn pulling her hand back, tooting in annoyance. Oh, bother, Evelyn had sighed, inspecting the ring. I've nicked the poor thing. A little scar for a life well lived, I suppose. It adds character, don't you think, Illyra? Perfection is for people who haven't done anything worth remembering. Illyra's breath hitched. She felt the room spinning. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. It's just a coincidence, she told herself, her mind racing to build a wall against the truth. Julian said it was his family heirloom. Maybe his grandmother had the same ring. Maybe the jeweler he bought it from had a vintage collection. But the wall was crumbling. She knew the history of that ring. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a mourning ring from the late 1800s that had been passed down through the Thorne women. It was unique. The way the gold ivy vines were hand-carved, one leaf near the prong had a slightly bent tip, a manufacturing flaw that Evelyn used to joke was a secret signature. Illyra looked at the ring on her finger. The leaf with the bent tip was there. A cold, oily sweat broke out across her forehead. She needed proof. She needed to know she wasn't losing her mind. She bypassed her coffee and went straight for her laptop, which she'd tucked into her travel bag. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing her cloud storage. She scrolled past photos of vacations, birthdays, and mundane office shots, diving deeper into the family folder. Finally, she found it. A photo taken 6 months before Evelyn died. It was a close-up of their two hands together, Illyra's young, smooth hand clasped in Evelyn's weathered, spotted one. The sun was hitting the emerald ring perfectly. Illyra zoomed in. 100%. 200%. 500%. The pixels blurred, but the shape was unmistakable. The clouded garden inside the stone had a distinctive V-shaped inclusion near the center. It was the same. The chip on the corner was visible as a tiny distortion in the light. It was the same. "What are you doing up so early, honey?" Illyra nearly jumped out of her skin. She slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet cottage. Julian was leaning against the bedroom doorframe, his hair tousled, his eyes sleepy and warm. He looked every bit the doting fiancé. He walked over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "Couldn't sleep?" he murmured. "Are you still on a high from last night?" "I know I am." Illyra felt his skin against hers and felt a wave of revulsion so strong she had to fight the urge to gag. The man holding her, kissing her neck, was the same man who had what? She couldn't even say the words in her head. To have this ring, he would have had to go to the Thorne family plot. He would have had to bring a shovel. He would have had to break the seal of the casket. He would have had to touch her grandmother's cold, preserved hand and pry the gold from her finger. "You're shaking," Julian said, pulling back to look at her face. His expression shifted from affection to a sharp, clinical concern. "Illyra? What's wrong?" I just had a nightmare," she lied, her voice sounding thin and brittle. "I think the excitement was just too much. I didn't sleep well." Julian's eyes drifted down to the laptop. "Work? On our engagement morning?" "No, just looking at old photos. Thinking about my grandmother. I wish she could have seen this," she said, testing him. Every word felt like a trap. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just smiled a sad, sympathetic smile and took her hand, the hand wearing the stolen ring, and kissed the knuckles. "She's watching, Illyra. I'm sure of it. And I think she'd be happy to know that you're being taken care of. That you have something beautiful to hold onto." The sheer audacity of his words chilled her to the bone. Something beautiful to hold onto. He was talking about a trophy of desecration. "Julian," she started, her heart hammering against her ribs, "where did you say this came from again?" "Your great aunt." "Yes," he said smoothly, heading toward the coffee pot. "Aunt Beatrice. She didn't have any children of her own, so she left her jewelry to the men in the family to use for their future wives. It's been in a safety deposit box for years." "Why do you ask?" It looks so much like a ring my grandmother had," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Julian poured himself a cup of coffee, his back to her. For a fraction of a second, he went perfectly still. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, he turned around with a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, you know what they say about vintage styles. They were all the rage back then. It's a classic design, Illyra. That's why I picked it. It reminded me of your family's history. I wanted to give you something that felt like home. He walked over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch felt like a serpent's scales. Don't overthink it, okay? Today is for us. Let's go for a walk on the beach. Let the fresh air clear your head. Ilora nodded, playing the part of the fragile, overwhelmed fiancé. But as she went to the bedroom to get dressed, her mind was a whirlwind of fire and ice. She didn't believe him. She couldn't. The Aunt Beatrice story was a lie. She had met Julian's family, and he had never mentioned a Beatrice. Moreover, the ring was too specific. The chip, the flaw in the gold, the garden in the emerald, it was a fingerprint. She looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror. She looked pale, haunted. She looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. She realized then that she couldn't just sit in this cottage and pretend. She needed to see the grave. She needed to know if the earth had been disturbed. Because if Julian had done what she suspected, he wasn't just a liar. He was a monster. And she was currently wearing his crime on her finger. As she pulled on her sweater, she felt the ring's coldness again. It wasn't just metal anymore. It felt like a shackle. I'll be ready in 5 minutes, she called out, her voice steadying with a new, dark resolve. She wasn't going for a walk on the beach. She was going to find the truth, even if it meant digging it up herself. The drive from the coastal cottage to the St. Jude's Memorial Gardens took nearly 40 minutes, but to Ilora, it felt like a descent into another dimension. She had managed to slip away by feigning a sudden, blinding migraine, the kind that required total darkness and absolute silence, she told Julian. He had been overly attentive, offering to rub her temples with lavender oil, his hands hovering near her face in a way that made her skin crawl. Eventually, he relented, promising to stay downstairs and catch up on work while she rested. The moment she heard the click of the bedroom door, Ilora had moved with the silent efficiency of a thief. She changed into dark jeans and a trench coat, shoved her hair into a beanie, and climbed out the ground floor window of the guest bathroom. She took the rental car, praying Julian wouldn't hear the engine turn over. Now, as she pulled into the gravel lot of the cemetery, the salt spray air of the coast had been replaced by the heavy, stagnant scent of damp cedar and old stone. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun dipping behind the horizon and casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of marble and granite. Ilora walked with purpose toward the Thorne family plot. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in her chest, beating against her ribs with a rhythm that screamed, "Go back, go back, go back." But her hand, the left one, the one weighed down by the emerald, felt like it was being pulled by an invisible magnetic force toward the earth. She reached the plot. It was a beautiful, secluded corner under the weeping willow where Evelyn Thorne had been laid to rest 3 years ago. The headstone was elegant, Evelyn Thorne, a light in every life. At first glance, everything looked normal. The flowers she had sent for the anniversary, white lilies and pale roses, were still there, though they were beginning to wilt. But as Ilora knelt, her eyes adjusted to the deepening gloom. She looked at the grass. Standard cemetery sod is thick, established, and uniform. But around the base of Evelyn's headstone, the grass looked tired. It was a shade yellower than the surrounding turf. Ilora reached out and touched a patch of earth. It was loose. Too loose for a grave that had been settled for 3 years. She began to dig with her bare fingers, ignoring the dirt wedging itself under her nails. About 2 inches down, her fingers hit something that wasn't soil. She pulled it back. It was a strip of plastic, the kind used in heavy-duty landscaping to keep weeds down. It had been sliced through and shoved back into place. The vertigo returned, more violent than before. Ilora looked closer at the edges of the grave. The sod hadn't been professionally removed, it had been hacked at. Someone had used a spade to lift the grass in uneven chunks, then tried to press them back down like a jigsaw puzzle that didn't quite fit. In the gaps between the chunks, the soil was dark and fresh, smelling of wet minerals and decay. Then, she saw it. Tucked beneath the low-hanging branch of a nearby hydrangea bush, partially obscured by dead leaves, was a flash of bright, artificial color. Illyra reached for it, her breath hitching in her throat. It was a work glove. Heavy-duty, gray synthetic leather with neon green trim. On the wrist strap, written in permanent marker that had slightly bled into the fabric, were two initials, J.M. Julian Miller. The world went silent. The wind in the willow trees, the distant hum of traffic, the beating of her own heart, it all vanished, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the object in her hand. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't a family heirloom from a fictional Aunt Beatrice. Julian had come here. He had come to this sacred, quiet place in the middle of the night. He had brought a shovel. He had stood where she was standing now, and he had violated the one thing Illyra held most dear. She looked down at the ring on her finger. The emerald seemed to pulse with a sickly, malevolent light. She tried to pull it off, a sudden, desperate need to be free of it. "Get off," she hissed, her voice cracking. "Get off me." She tugged at the gold band, but her finger had swollen in the humidity and the stress. The ring wouldn't budge. It sat there, stubborn and heavy, a piece of her grandmother's corpse rebranded as a promise of love. The horror of the act began to play out in her mind in vivid, sickening detail. Julian, the man who claimed to love her, had used a crowbar to pry open the lid of a casket. He had looked down at the remains of the woman who had raised Illyra. He had seen the ring on her skeletal finger, the ring Illyra had cried over as the coffin was closed, and he had seen value. He had seen a way to save money. He had seen a way to play the hero without the cost of a soul. He hadn't just stolen jewelry. He had stolen Illyra's peace. He had turned her grief into a crime scene. Illyra slumped against the cold marble of the headstone, the muddy glove clutched to her chest. She felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. Julian had talked about roots. He had talked about legacy. He had quite literally dug up her roots to build his legacy. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to the headstone, her tears carving tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Grandma." A twig snapped behind her. Illyra froze. The cemetery was supposed to be closed. The gates were locked. She had climbed the low stone wall near the back. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the shadows of the cypress trees. For a moment, she thought she saw a silhouette, a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing near the path. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he here? Had he followed her? The silhouette moved, but it was only a trick of the wind and the swaying branches. She was alone. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to lean on the headstone for support. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go back to that cottage and lie in that bed next to him. But she knew she had to. If she fled now, he would know. He was stronger than her, and clearly, he was capable of things she couldn't fathom. She needed to be smart. She needed to be as cold and calculating as he had been when he pushed that shovel into the dirt. Illyra tucked the glove into the deep pocket of her trench coat. She patted the loose soil back into place over the disturbed grave, smoothing the yellowed grass as best she could. It was a futile gesture, but it was all she had. As she walked back to the car, the ring on her finger felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It wasn't just gold and stone anymore. It was a shackle. It was a witness. She got into the car and stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face smudged with cemetery mud. She looked like a woman who had seen the bottom of a grave. "Recycled love," she whispered, echoing Julian's voice from her imagination. She started the engine. She had to go back. She had to sit across from him at dinner. She had to let him kiss her. And she had to wait for the perfect moment to bury him, not in the earth, but in the truth. Because Elora Thorne was no longer just a grieving granddaughter. She was a woman wearing a dead woman's luck, and she was going to make sure Julian Miller felt every bit of the weight he had invited into their lives. The drive back was a blur of sodium lights and silent screams. Elora drove with a precision that bordered on the mechanical, her eyes fixed on the road while her mind replayed the image of that muddy, neon-trimmed glove. JM. Those two letters felt like brands seared into her retina. She parked the rental car a block away from the cottage, not wanting the sound of the tires on the gravel driveway to alert him just yet. She needed a moment. She looked at her hands in the dim glow of the dashboard. Her fingernails were rimmed with black earth, the earth that had protected her grandmother for 3 years until Julian decided it was an obstacle. She took a deep breath, wiped her face with a damp cloth she found in the glove box, and scrubbed at her nails until the skin was raw. She tucked the glove deep into her coat pocket, feeling its weight like a leaden heart. When she walked through the front door, the cottage felt different. The romantic ambience Julian had curated, the lingering scent of expensive candles and the soft jazz, now felt like the set of a horror movie. It was too polished, too intentional. It was a shroud draped over a rot. Elora. Julian appeared at the top of the stairs, a book in his hand, looking like the picture of scholarly devotion. You're up? I thought you were sleeping off that migraine. I was just about to come check on you. He descended the stairs, his movements fluid and graceful. As he reached the bottom, he stepped toward her, reaching out to cup her face. Elora had to exert every ounce of her willpower not to flinch. His skin felt like a threat. You look pale, he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. And your hands are freezing. Where have you been, Elora? I heard the car leave a while ago. I needed air, she said, her voice sounding hollow, as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. The headache was suffocating. I thought a drive by the coast might help. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. It was a flicker, a momentary lapse in his mask of concern. In this weather? It's freezing out there. You should have told me. I would have gone with you. I needed to be alone, Julian. With my thoughts? Especially after everything. She walked past him into the kitchen, the emerald on her finger catching the light of the overhead lamp. It felt heavier now, a pulsing weight that seemed to throb in time with her heartbeat. She reached for a glass of water, her hand trembling. Julian followed her, leaning against the marble island. Is it the ring? Are you overwhelmed? I know it's a lot to take in, the history, the commitment. Elora turned to face him. The kitchen was bright, the warm yellow light reflecting off the stainless steel appliances. There were no shadows to hide in now. The history, she repeated slowly. Tell me about Aunt Beatrice again, Julian. I've met your mother, your sisters, your cousins. I've heard stories about your grandfather the fisherman and your uncle the architect. But Beatrice, she's new. Julian didn't blink. She was my father's sister. A bit of a recluse. She lived in London for 40 years. She died shortly before we met. Why the sudden interest in family genealogy, Elora? Because, Elora said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I find it fascinating that your Aunt Beatrice had the exact same taste as my grandmother. Right down to the microscopic chip on the emerald. Right down to the way the gold ivy is carved with a tiny flaw on the third leaf. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's expression didn't change, but his body went rigid. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the sudden, sharp tension of a wire about to snap. What are you saying, Elora? He asked, his voice low and steady. I went to the cemetery, Julian. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the gray synthetic glove. She dropped it on the marble counter between them. The neon green trim looked garish and violent against the white stone. A small clump of dried mud fell from the fingertip and skittered across the surface. Julian stared at the glove. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look horrified. He looked annoyed. Like a man who had been interrupted while finishing a difficult puzzle. "You followed me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't have to follow you," Elora spat, the rage finally breaking through her icy exterior. "You left a trail of destruction. You dug up my grandmother, Julian. You opened her casket. You touched her, you took this from her dead hand." She held up her left hand, the emerald glinting like a poisonous eye. "Do you have any idea how insane that is? How ghoulish? How absolutely monstrous?" Julian let out a long, slow breath. He stood up straight, his posture shifting from the doting boyfriend to something sharper, colder, and infinitely more pragmatic. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. Instead, he walked around the island toward her. Elora backed away until her spine hit the cold handle of the refrigerator. "Listen to yourself, Elora," he said, his voice calm, almost patronizing. "You're talking about monsters and ghouls. I'm talking about reality. I'm talking about our future. Our future is built on a grave." She screamed. "Our future is built on what we have now," Julian countered, his eyes flashing with a sudden, fervent intensity. "That ring was sitting in the dark, Elora. It was rotting in the dirt, serving no one. It was a waste of beauty. A waste of capital. It was her final wish." "Dead people don't have wishes," Julian said flatly. "They have legacies. And what better legacy for Evelyn Thorne than to provide the foundation for her granddaughter's happiness? Do you know what that ring is worth? It's a 5-carat untreated Colombian emerald. In that setting? It's a house. It's a college fund for our kids. It's the security I haven't been able to give you because the firm is struggling." Elora stared at him, her mouth agape. The lack of remorse was more terrifying than the act itself. He saw the world in balance sheets and utility. He had looked at her grandmother's resting place and seen an untapped resource. "You stole from the dead because you were broke," she whispered, the disgust thick in her throat. "I reclaimed it for us," Julian corrected. "I didn't want some generic, mass-produced piece of tin from a mall. I wanted you to have the best. And the best was already yours, it was just buried. I saved us $50,000, Elora. Think about that. Think about what that does for our life together." He reached out to touch her shoulder, his face softening into a terrifyingly sincere smile. "I did it because I love you. I did the hard thing, the unpleasant thing, so that we could have a better life. Most men would have just bought a cheap diamond and lied about the quality. I gave you something with a soul. I gave you history. You gave me a crime," Elora said, tears finally spilling over. "You gave me a nightmare. Every time I look at this hand, I don't see you. I see her. I see you prying her fingers apart. I see the dirt." She grabbed a bottle of dish soap from the sink and began frantically lathering her finger. She scrubbed until the skin was beet red, the ring finally sliding off with a wet, sucking sound. She threw it at his chest. The gold hit his linen shirt and fell to the floor, bouncing with a dull metallic thud before rolling under the kitchen table. Julian looked down at the ring, then back at Elora. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating light. The mask was gone. The man she had loved for 3 years was a fiction, a character Julian had played to get close to a woman of legacy. "You're being hysterical," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "You're going to calm down, and you're going to pick that ring up. Because if you don't, if you make a scene, if you call the police, do you think anyone will believe you? A grieving girl who thinks her fiancé dug up her grandmother? I have the receipts for a similar ring from a jeweler in New York. I've been planning this for a long time, Elora. I'm very thorough. He stepped closer, pinning her against the fridge. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. We are going to get married. We are going to use that ring. And we are going to forget this little midnight excursion ever happened. Do you understand? Illyra looked into his eyes and realized she wasn't looking at a man. She was looking at a predator who had mistaken her for prey. But Julian had forgotten one thing. He had stolen her grandmother's ring, but he hadn't stolen her grandmother's spirit. I understand everything now, Julian, she said, her voice turning as cold as the Atlantic wind. I understand exactly who you are. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him with a clarity that made him flinch for the first time. The psychological game had shifted. He thought he had trapped her in his pragmatic reality, but Illyra was already looking past him, toward the only way the story could end. Pick up the ring, Illyra, he commanded. No, she said. You pick it up. It belongs to you now. You and the dirt. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged, uneven breathing of two people who had once promised to love each other forever. Julian stood by the table, the emerald ring glinting on the floor near his feet like a fallen star. He looked at Illyra not with the eyes of a lover, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had already factored her soul into his net worth. He bent down, his movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the ring. He blew a speck of dust off the gold and held it up to the light. You think you're better than me, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. But you're wearing the clothes I bought you. You're living in the lifestyle I've curated. This ring? It was a gift. A gift that cost me more than you'll ever know. It didn't cost you a penny, Julian, Illyra whispered, her back still pressed against the fridge. It cost you your humanity. It cost you the right to walk among the living without looking over your shoulder. Julian stepped closer, the ring held between his thumb and forefinger. We're leaving. We're going back to the city, we're getting married, and you are going to tell everyone how romantic this weekend was. You want to be a thorn? Fine. Start acting like one. Use the resources you have. Stop being a martyr for a woman who is literally dust. Illyra looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel fear. She felt a profound, icy clarity. She realized that Julian's power was a facade, a thin layer of linen and lies. He was a man who stole from the dead because he was too small to build anything for himself. You're right, Julian, she said, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone that made him pause. It is a resource. And I think we should go back. One last time. To say goodbye. Julian's eyes flickered with suspicion. To the grave. If I'm going to wear this, I need to make peace with it, she lied, her face a mask of grief-stricken submission. I need to stand where you stood. I need to tell her that I'm taking it. If we don't do this, I'll see her every time I close my eyes. Is that what you want? A wife who screams in her sleep. Julian hesitated, then a slow, smug smile spread across his face. He thought he had broken her. He thought she was finally seeing reason. Fine, he said, tucking the ring into his pocket. We go now. While the sun is coming up. We finish this, and then we never speak her name again. The drive back to St. Jude's was a journey through a liminal space. The world was turning from charcoal to a bruised, misty gray. They didn't speak. Julian drove with one hand on the wheel, the other tapping a rhythm on his knee, a triumphant, nervous energy radiating from him. Illyra stared out the window, watching the skeletal trees fly past, her hand clutching the small, heavy object she had pulled from her jewelry box before they left the cottage. When they reached the cemetery, the morning mist was so thick it swallowed the car. The gates were still locked, but Julian knew the way now. He led her over the back wall, his movements practiced, his lack of hesitation a chilling reminder of his previous visit. They reached the thorn plot. The air was deathly still. The yellowed grass and the disturbed earth looked even more grotesque in the early light. Julian gestured to the headstone. "Go on then. Say what you have to say." Illyra knelt. The dampness of the earth seeped into her jeans immediately, but she didn't care. She looked at the name Evelyn Thorne and felt a sudden, overwhelming warmth, not from the sun, which was still hidden, but from a memory of her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of cinnamon, and the weight of a hand that had never taken anything it hadn't earned. "I'm here, Grandma," she whispered. Julian stood behind her, his hands in his pockets, looking bored. "Hurry up, Illyra. The groundskeeper will be here soon." Illyra reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, ornate wooden box, the one her grandmother had given her for her 10th birthday. She opened it. Inside wasn't jewelry, but a heavy, jagged stone she had picked up from the driveway of the cottage. She turned to Julian. "Give it to me." "The ring." He reached into his pocket and handed it over, his fingers brushing hers. Illyra took the emerald. It felt heavier than ever, a physical manifestation of Julian's betrayal. She didn't put it on. Instead, she placed it inside the wooden box, nestled against the cold, rough stone. She snapped the lid shut. "What are you doing?" Julian snapped, stepping forward. "That box is worth nothing. Put the ring on." "This ring doesn't belong to the living," Illyra said, standing up. Her voice was no longer a whisper, it was a decree. "And neither do you." She looked Julian dead in the eye. "I didn't come here to make peace with you, Julian. I came here to return what you stole. And to tell you that I recorded everything." Julian froze. "What?" Illyra pulled her phone from her other pocket. The screen was lit up, showing a voice memo app. The timer was at 64 minutes. "Every word you said in that kitchen. The recycling love. The reclaiming capital. The admission that you dug this grave. It's all here. And it's already been uploaded to a private server. If I don't check in by noon, it goes to your mother, your firm, and the police." Julian's face went from smug to ghostly white in a heartbeat. He lunged for the phone, but Illyra stepped back, the wooden box held high. "If you touch me," she said, her voice vibrating with a power he had never seen, "I'll scream. And in this silence, the whole neighborhood will hear. You want to be thorough, Julian? You forgot that I was raised by the woman who built this legacy. She taught me how to spot a weed in a garden of roses." Julian stopped, his chest heaving. The perfect man was gone. In his place was a cornered animal, shivering in the morning cold. "You wouldn't," he hissed. "You'd destroy your own reputation." "The scandal?" "I don't care about my reputation," Illyra said. "I care about her rest." She knelt again and began to dig. Not with her fingers this time, but with a small gardening trowel she had hidden in her coat. She dug deep, past the loose sod Julian had hacked at, down into the firm, ancient earth. She placed the wooden box inside. "This stays here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you stay away. From me. From this family. From any woman who has a soul you think you can harvest." She stood up, covered the hole, and packed the earth down with the heel of her boot. She looked at Julian, who was standing like a statue among the graves. "The rental car keys are in the grass somewhere," she said, tossing her own set of keys, the ones to the cottage, at his feet. "I'm taking the car we drove here. You can find your own way back to the city. Or you can stay here. It seems you're more comfortable among the dead anyway." "Illyra, wait," Julian started, his voice cracking. He looked small. He looked like the thief he was. "Don't," she said, raising a hand. "Some things are meant to stay buried, Julian. Our relationship is one of them. If I ever see your face again, if you ever try to contact me, the recording goes public. Consider this your severance package." She turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't look at the mist or the shadows. She walked toward the gates, toward the rising sun that was finally beginning to burn through the gray. As she reached the car, she felt a strange lightness in her left hand. The phantom weight of the emerald was gone. The coldness had vanished. For the first time in 3 years, the anniversary of her grandmother's death didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a release. She started the engine and drove out of the cemetery. In the rearview mirror, she saw a lone figure standing in the middle of the thorn plot, surrounded by silent stones and the rising steam of the earth. Illyria took a deep breath of the morning air. It tasted of salt, of earth, and of freedom. The ring was back in the dark, where it belonged, and for the first time in a long time, Illyria Thorne was finally, truly, in the light.